This
Bug me.
is the Democracy at Work North County Action Group reading and discussion, and we are going to be tackling Richard Wolff's Democracy at Work, A Cure for Capitalism again. We are picking up where we left off some time ago. We had finished the introduction. We are starting part one. The book is divided into 3 parts. Part 1 is titled Capitalism in Deep Trouble. We'll be starting Chapter 1, Capitalism and Crises. Should I begin, or do you want to?
You can go ahead.
Okay.
And just to make sure on the format, I'm okay. We're okay to interrupt whenever we have comments made.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Sure
do not.
Okay, sounds good.
Do not respect my reading at all. I highly encourage interruptions. And then,
right.
And barring an interruption, or if you just don't have much to say, I'll stop at some point after, a page or two, and then we can switch up.
Okay.
So, Chapter 1, Capitalism and Crises. Like all important topics, capitalism has been defined and understood quite differently by different people and groups throughout its history. That fact requires everyone using the term to be clear and explicit about the particular definition being used. No one should proceed as if any one definition is the only one or is the definition on which everyone agrees. For example, many contemporary usages of capitalism in the media, among politicians, and in academic treatments focus on 2 key dimensions. The first is private property. Capitalism is a system in which the means of production, land, tools, equipment, raw materials, and products, goods and services, are privately owned by individuals and enterprises. They are not owned collectively by society as a whole or by the state apparatus representing, at least in theory, society as a whole. The second dimension is the market. Capitalism is a system in which productive resources and produced outputs are distributed by means of freely negotiated exchanges between their private owners. Distribution is not accomplished by means of the state's or any other collective agency's planned decisions. Thus, the 20th century's great confrontation between capitalism and socialism was widely defined to be a struggle between private property and markets on the one hand, and socialized property and government planning on the other. I do not use that popular definition in this book. A full discussion of the different definitions of capitalism and of the disagreements among their adherents would take us far afield. Instead, I will underscore some problems with the popular definition as an introduction to the definition I use. Private property is indeed a prevalent feature of capitalism. However, capitalist economies also typically contain significant amounts of productive property and products owned by state apparatuses in the name of the society as a whole. In the United States, for example, harbors, airspace, transportation facilities, military equipment, large tracts of land, and many educational institutions are publicly owned. Likewise, markets are common mechanisms of distribution, yet many capitalist economies also include the distribution of goods and services in non-market ways. In the United States, for example, food is distributed via food stamps issued to certain parts of the population, and many communities distribute park, fire, police, and school services to citizens based on local notions of citizens' needs, not on market exchanges. Inside most households, members produce all sorts of goods and services, cooked meals, clean clothes and rooms, repaired furniture, and so on, distributed to other household members according to traditional forms of household planning, barter, and exchange, not by means of market exchanges. I'm going to pause there. What do you think of all that?
The one thing that stuck with me I wanted to mention is just that I'm glad that he tells us that some parts of the country are owned publicly, whether people are aware of it or not. And the first thing that comes to mind, as we were speaking earlier, was about the wilderness preservation system and all of the wilderness designated by the state throughout the last 50 years since the Wilderness Preservation Act was passed, all of that is public lands, and so it's good for people to know that that is, publicly owned by all of us, and it's for our use, and it's not, it's some of the last remaining bits of land that is not, in the hands of a company to be used in such a way that, that goes against, what we're talking about. And so, yeah, that I just want to mention that.
The point you raised, though, maybe somewhat inadvertently, is that, he's absolutely right to suggest that that distinction between public and private property is it's characteristic of capitalism, but it is kind of a stretch to say it's a defining characteristic for reasons that you just alluded to and that he spelled out, because capitalistic systems contain all the public land, publicly owned, and publicly owned other things. But what's interesting, right, and maybe kind of a source or a crux of struggle, is that in capitalism there's that incessant move to try to privatize what was once publicly owned and operated, right? And then
Sure.
and it's that because that privatization is what allows things to be commodified, and that allows for things to be sold on the market, and it also allows for usually surplus to be extracted, which is the aim of capitalism, that, and the constant accumulation of capital, because without that, and that requires the private ownership. And so I wonder if maybe he is de-emphasizing it for particular reasons, but I think it's important for us to be attentive to the fact that that is a source of struggle within capitalism, and that maybe it's a more defining characteristic than maybe he's going to lay out here in order to make his argument.
It also makes me wonder a little bit about what a staunch capitalist, free market type individual would envision a country would look like if it was completely capitalistic through and through, without any public owned land or harbors or transportation facilities or anything like that. I wonder what does a staunch capitalist view, or what would they envision as a society with nothing publicly owned? What would that look like? I wonder.
A libertarian hellscape, I think. A pseudo-libertarian, because you know what? There would still be public services, namely the police, because I don't think a society like that could exist without the state apparatus to enforce what is inevitably going to be,
that's a good point.
Massive inequality, not to mention the anti-democratic features that it would entail. And so, so I don't think there would be possible to eliminate all of it, and probably parts of what's publicly owned, public services, like the police, would have to expand quite a bit. And so there's that flip side too, like very dialectical. One thing that I was going to mention, at Mount San Jacinto College, Chris actually had organized the Talon. He was editor of the Talon, the student newspaper there. They had organized a screening of that film Freeway Flyers, which is about adjuncts, and the adjunct struggle. And one thing that I really liked, they had a scene, because they have several scenes, when they cut from scene to scene, they show cars on the freeway, and they often have, like the radio. But in one, they had a clip from something Chomsky had said, which is, pretty pointed, I think, that there's a standard measure that those who are out to maximize private profit will attempt to push through, and it is, privatize what you can, and then say, oh, well, look how inefficient this still what remains of the public service is, and use that as justification to privatize even more, and then say, oh, well, look how increasingly inefficient and bureaucratic this still what remains of this public institution is, so privatize even more, to the point where it's fully privatized and, in many cases, not functional, at least for the people that it once or was supposed to serve.
Sure. Yeah.
So, do you want to pick up where we left off?
Yeah, sure. Is it likewise markets?
I think it's moreover.
Excellent.
Yeah, moreover private property and markets. Or because we covered the likewise markets.
I flipped. Yeah, I flipped the page on accident.
Okay.
To look at the past quote there. Okay, so moreover, private property and markets do not distinguish capitalists from other types of economic systems in human history. For example, the slaves in the non-capitalist economic system of the U.S. South before the Civil War were private property. Similarly, in many parts of late medieval Europe, the land, horses, plows, and mills were often privately owned means of production, yet we refer to the economic system of that time as feudalism, not capitalism. Markets were also often features of slavery and feudalism as well as capitalism. For example, feudal lords often sold the products of their serfs' labor in markets. Feudalism thus worked with a market system of distribution. Just to stop really quickly, I was not really aware of that, or I had never thought about that as being as being done by feudal lords, because I always thought of feudalism and serfdom as a sort of system where just the serfs would plow the land and give the spoils to the lords, but I never thought of the idea of lords then turning around and selling that and making a profit off it. That's
I mean, it's good to point out, because you have that fundamental class struggle, division between the serf and the lord, and that's not characterized by a market relation, right? It's as you said, the spoils just go to the lord, but then those spoils are bought and sold by lords on the market, or were. So yeah, that's interesting to know for sure.
Yet another example of sort of vicious cycle that you already mentioned. Okay, so similarly, the cotton produced by slaves in the U.S. South was regularly sold in world markets by means of exchange for money.
And so,
in short,
real quickly,
private property.
Real quickly, I was just going to say, I should have let you finish reading that, but I mean, there's several historians that have made the argument that slavery provided the necessary capital for capitalism, and so that's a less surprising to me argument to make. And to me, it also, I think, underscores, a couple things. The way in which capitalism is perfectly content, meaning the system that, has certain defining characteristics, which I think Wolff is going to point out, but it's perfectly content to use these elements of other systems. And so I think that's worth thinking about, because elements of other systems, even say maybe, obviously not slavery or feudalism, but more liberatory ones, like maybe systems of worker self-directed enterprises or something, in order to try to develop those, there's that constant risk of them being absorbed within, co-opted by the larger economic system. Anyway,
that's a good point.
Sorry, go ahead.
And I think we've spoken about that before. No, that's fine. Okay, so in short, private property and markets do not provide us with a clear demarcation between capitalism and, for example, slavery and feudalism as economic systems. Nor do we get much further if we try to deal with this problem by invoking individual, quote, freedom. A commonly held view is that slaves lacked freedom because they were property and serfs lacked freedom because they were tied to their feudal manners, but workers in capitalism suffer neither of those forms of coercion. Among the problems with this definition is the fact that, under capitalism, wage workers are not free, other than formally, legalistically, because to live even minimally, they must work for others. They must sell their labor power to those who own the means of production in order to survive. I want to hold off 1 second.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was just saying, Wolff is waxing
what were
really.
You gonna say?
I was going to say Wolff is waxing really Marxian there.
I was wondering about this. So let me just repeat this. Among the problems with this definition is the fact that under capitalism, wage workers are not free because to live even minimally, they must work for others. And so even in a paradigm that he would want, maybe something where there's more worker owned enterprises, the individuals living in the society would still be forced to work. I mean, they wouldn't be forced to work for force someone.
That's the
because
key distinction. That's the key distinction for him, I think, and for a lot of proponents of alternative economics, is that I would argue there probably is a really important difference between selling your labor power to somebody else who gets to decide what happens to the fruits of your labor, right, the surplus that you produce, versus working collectively with somebody and collectively deciding together. But and some also would.
True, I agree.
Yeah, some also would counter that, I mean, to try to suggest that because you would have to sell's not the right word, but because you would have to work in a, say, cooperative economy, that you aren't free because you have to work. Well, I mean, if you didn't have any system or any any ways of ensuring that you have the means to survive, then you would die anyway. There's never that complete freedom unless
it's
society.
It's a legitimate forcing.
Yeah. That would be the argument anyway. Okay, so.
Yeah, and I agree.
Do you want to continue?
So continuing. Because of these and many other difficulties, I define capitalism differently. My distinctive focus is not on property or distribution mechanisms or freedom. Instead, I highlight the internal organization of production and distribution, how the social sites where goods and services are produced and distributed organize those processes. A capitalist system is, then, one in which a mass of people, productive workers, interact with nature to fashion both means of production, tools, equipment, and raw materials, and final products for human consumption. They produce a total output larger than the portion of that output, wages, given back to them. The wage portion sustains the productive workers. It provides their consumption and secures their continued productive labor. The difference between their total output and their wage portion is called the surplus, and it accrues to a different group of people, the employers of productive laborers, capitalists.
Will you pause for just one moment there? And so, there he's introducing his key term, right, which is central to his definition of capitalism and his critique of it. One thing, though, that seems omitted is the fact that, why is it that the capitalists expropriate the surplus? And that is because they then have to and are compelled to realize that as profit on the market. And so he's kind of bracketing off that, which is really an integral feature of capitalism. And that leads me to the other point that I wanted to make, right, is that while I think it's fair enough that he wants to argue that markets aren't the defining characteristic for capitalism based on how he thinks it's most purposive to define it. And that's fair, right? He's explained how he thinks it's better defined and explained. But at the same time, that kind of leaves out the question as to whether, say, if you're trying to construct an alternative, whether markets should be the key mechanism for distribution or allocation. Because some would argue that they shouldn't, because of, say, the coercive laws of competition, which is another Marxian thing, right? That's the idea that you have enterprises competing against each other, right? And that leads to a whole host of problems. And you would potentially, although maybe not have that as many disastrous outcomes, because you have workers collectively deciding, and they maybe would work together across enterprises more, but you'd still have that competition, that market-based competition, which can cause a lot of societal problems, like externalities, things that don't factor into the market-based decisions, as well as, say, that pressure to compete with others, to lower costs, to do lots of other things, which, again, you may not do to the extent that you would do if, the owner or the shareholders don't really care what happens to the people who are producing the surplus, but there's still, those imperatives and those pressures that would remain, I think, if markets were the key distribution mechanism.
Absolutely, I agree.
Yeah. You want to read it?
And say it again?
Go ahead.
I was going to just say that I was thinking of something totally different from that passage. Something a little bit less in depth, but I was thinking about the idea of mercantilism being a sort of transitionary period, or a certain type of transitional economic system that took place between feudalism and, I guess you would say, I think slavery, I guess chronologically is what it would move into. But I was trying to think of where did we start getting the idea of, well, where should the surplus go? And to me, it was kind of came with the idea of a joint stock company as being a sort of proto corporation where you would be financed with many wealthy individuals together. You go overseas and you would exploit the land in whatever ways, beaver skins, whatever it might be, and then you'd be able to come up with a profit at that point, and then the profit obviously would go toward the joint stock company that was handling the entire endeavor. And so I'm thinking that that's kind of where that whole idea started, or at least took off, which was with the joint stock company kind of giving way to companies, proper, and then corporations down the road, what we're in with today, and things like that. I was just kind of making that connection of mercantilism as an economic system that I don't hear Wolff talk too much about, but I think that's because it's not really it's kind of a hybrid version of other systems. I'm not really sure how to put it, but
right,
I'm not exactly
right.
versed in it, and so
you should.
But yeah, that's just what I had.
Yeah, you should send him a question about that and ask if he will explain it on Economic Update. That'd be neat. He does take questions,
That's a good idea.
Okay.
That's right.
Do you want to read just a little bit more, and then I'll pick up? Yep.
Sure. So, oh no, I may have lost my. Oh, there it is. Okay, the capitalists receive the surplus from the productive laborers by virtue of a wage labor contract entered into between capitalist and worker. This wage labor contract specifies a particular commodity exchange. The capitalist agrees to pay the worker regularly for her or his labor time. The worker agrees to sell her or his labor time to the capitalist. The worker further typically agrees to use the tools, equipment, raw materials, and space provided by the capitalist. Finally, the worker agrees that the total output emerging from his or her labor is immediately and totally the private property of the capitalist. The productive laborers, those who produce the surplus, use the wages paid to them by the capitalist to buy the goods and services they consume and to pay personal taxes. The capitalists use the surplus they obtain from their productive employees to reproduce the conditions that allow them to keep obtaining surpluses from their productive employees. For example, they use part of their surplus to hire supervisors to make sure the productive laborers work effectively. They use another part to pay taxes to a state apparatus that will, among other activities, enforce the contracts they have with their workers. They use yet another part of the surplus to sustain institutions, churches, schools, think tanks, advertising enterprises, that persuade workers and their families that this capitalist system is good, unalterable, and so on, so that it is accepted and perpetuated. I don't know if you want to take over at that point.
Sure. And then I guess I would just point out, to briefly summarize, so he made the point that workers are essentially commodities, or at least their labor power is in capitalism, which is a really important Marxist critique. Mm-hmm. And also a key element in the explanation of the experience of alienation in capitalism.
That a lot of people don't seem to really understand, or at least rather they don't seem to notice. A lot of people these days, the layman, doesn't really, what's the word? They don't seem to characterize their work as a commodity. I feel like they might consider themselves commodities in a sort of indirect way, I wonder. As instead of thinking of themselves as something that produces work and the work that's done is the commodity, they see themselves as a sort of object or piece of capital that the capitalist has and uses to,
That might be part of the whole, what's often called the neoliberal ethic, right? That you are your own entrepreneurial force, right? And it's your imperative to maximize your worth on the market. And so that might account for some of that.
Which I think is, I don't know. I think that's, I don't know what the word for it would be. Some sort of perversion there,
Yeah.
or a euphemism.
To say the least, yeah. And then the other thing that I wanted to point out is that kind of at the end there, he makes another common Marxist critique, which is a good one, an important one, that these cultural institutions, social institutions, churches, schools, think tanks, ad enterprises, etc., that they persuade us that the capitalist system is good and unchangeable. And of course they do that, but they don't only do that, right? And that's one thing that some more conventional Marxists sometimes forget or purposefully don't emphasize because they have a different game plan, is that those institutions, the culture can be a source of resistance too, of anti-capitalist resistance.
Of course, absolutely.
Okay, so I will pick up where you left off. The workers who sign contracts with capitalist employers fall into two categories. Productive laborers are those directly engaged in the production of the goods and services that their employers sell. Their labor yields the surplus that employers receive and distribute to reproduce their positions as capitalists. The term unproductive laborers refers to all those engaged in providing the needed context or conditions of existence for productive workers to generate surpluses. The unproductive laborers have their wages paid and their means of work provided by capitalists. The latter distribute parts of the surplus they get from productive laborers to pay and provide for the unproductive laborers. This distinction is so problematic, in my view, even if there is, a modicum of truth to it, because it's so hard to say, oh, this person's producing a surplus, this person's just doing work that makes the conditions for that production to be possible, because there's such a blurring of those lines.
I'm not sure. I was having trouble following that. I don't know if you could maybe elucidate what he's trying to say here, but I'm just going to read it again. The unproductive laborer refers to all those engaged in providing the needed context or, quote, conditions of existence for productive workers to generate surpluses.
Mm-hmm.
The unproductive laborers have their wages paid and their means of work provided by capitalists. Who is he referring to here? What would an example be of these individuals?
Well, I think you might have several different types. So you might have, say, the managerial class, and I don't know if he's lumping them here in there, but say like the manager of a factory or whatever, who ensures that the workers stay on task and also helps coordinate things or whatever. And so that they might fall into this category. But then also, I'm pretty sure that this would also have to include, say, people who make sure that the machines are clean and running and that sort of thing, or who make sure the place where you're working is suitable for production. Like anything like that, I think would fall. Anybody who does something like that,
like a cleaning person.
Yeah, although I wouldn't want to limit
something.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to limit it to just cleaning. I mean, we could brainstorm here. Who else might he be thinking? Who else might he be thinking of? Who would not be involved directly in, say, producing? And so it's hard too, because it's not always just production of a concrete product. Sometimes it's services. In which case, like, how do you tell like which service is most fundamental? Because everybody often plays a part.
Exactly. That's what I was about to say, is that you cannot, if you have the productive labor, let's just take a really easy example of maybe someone in a steel mill shaping metals in some way for a particular machine or something.
Uh-huh.
You couldn't have that factory function without a cleaning service.
Yeah, or without the mechanic who makes sure the machines are doing what they're supposed to. Right?
Yeah, exactly. And he or she, the mechanic, is not. I guess I don't. I think we're at fault in thinking like in super simplistic terms of like making an object, and that's the producer, or that's the person that is a productive. I don't think that's. But on the other hand, I don't really know who he's referring to here, unless he's referring to maybe like charities or maybe some source of funds that go into these productive endeavors. Maybe in some way, I'm not really sure. Those aren't laborers.
No, because he's, I think, thinking his level of analysis is the enterprise right here, I believe. Because I thought about that for a second too, like, is he talking about public service workers? But no, they're not paid by capitalists, right? They're paid by the state. That's different. That comes from taxes. And so I think he's talking at the enterprise level, at the specific level of the capitalist corporation. And so I don't think we were wrong to suggest that he's creating this dichotomy and lumping some folks in who it seems like are also very much, it's hard to distinguish them from the productive laborers, in my view.
Yeah, exactly. In my view as well. I don't really know who he's referring to. I would have loved for him to include an example.
That would have been helpful. Yeah, a concrete example at this point, especially when you're dealing with, abstract theory. Anyway, I'll continue. Maybe he clarifies later on.
Ooh.
Huh.
Consultants.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I don't know.
No, I mean that's exactly
that's
exactly it. But the thing is, like, I still had problem with the distinction because their work is often, so inextricable from the surplus getting produced. Like, in some cases, if you don't have somebody to consult, like, he might also be thinking about here, and I don't know because he might have another label for these folks, but say lawyers that help keep the corporation out of trouble, so they can go on continuing to produce the surplus and maybe, it destroy the environment or whatever the case may be. So they may be part of it. I'm just trying
I think that's more what it is, and not the consultants, because he mentions those engaged in providing the needed context. The consultant is not necessary to provide the context.
That's right.
The lawyers would be. I
think. But so would, say, the mechanic, the guy who fixes the machines, So I think he's probably lumping them in there too.
I think he's a productive.
Well, I would say so. I would say even the lawyer is, just in, a kind of perverse way. So I still have a problem with distinction. But anyway, I will proceed and maybe he clarifies. Okay. So in short, the capitalist economic system divides people into three basic economic groups: productive laborers, capitalists, and unproductive laborers. Okay, just as the social context for the economic system, politics and culture, shapes and influences the economy, so the reverse also holds. To focus on a society's economic system, as this book does not mean that economics is any more important than politics, culture, or nature in the interaction among them that shapes every society. My focus on the capitalist economic system is driven chiefly by the widespread neglect of this dimension of today's social problems. One purpose of this book is to rectify that neglect. For the last half-century, the capitalist economic system in the United States, and indeed in many other parts of the world, has gotten a free pass in terms of criticism and debate. Intense debates have swirled around other basic institutions or systems, such as marriage, schools, healthcare delivery, transportation, and urban structure. Criticisms about their current conditions and problems have informed proposals for changes ranging from the relatively minor to the fundamental. However, our economic system, capitalism, has been almost entirely exempted from critical discussion, as if some taboo precludes criticism. Business and political leaders, the mainstream mass media, and the bulk of the academic community have substituted celebration and cheerleading for serious criticism and debate of capitalism.
Hold on really quick. Sorry.
Yeah.
Kind of when I hear you say it's been entirely exempted from critical discussion, I hear Nancy Pelosi in the back of my mind. we are in a capitalist economy.
Yeah.
There's no other, there's no other form of economics we're gonna take up.
Yeah.
We are a capitalist nation. That's exactly what I hear when I hear you read that. So just wanted to mention that.
Just a little recent historical note. So I'd been involved in, various, and usually tangentially involved in various activist type efforts since, I don't know how long, but probably more seriously since maybe when I started the PhD program when I was in Carbondale around 2010, and involved in my grad union and whatever else. But also, I wouldn't say just my involvement in activist or militant organizing, but also interested in this sort of thing. And really, when people say that it wasn't until Occupy Wall Street that you could talk about economic inequality and maybe even, dare say, discuss the merits and problems of capitalism, I think they're so right. Because I remember that milieu, that cultural milieu, and it was like impossible to break through to somebody. Like, it just wasn't even a thinkable thought that the underlying economic system has problems, right? Or that even economic inequality is an issue. And thank goodness for Occupy for changing, among other things, for changing that rhetoric in the public discussion and narrative so that we can actually even talk about these sorts of things. And, it wasn't just Occupy, but I think that movement played a really big role in helping change the public discussion narrative, for sure.
To give a comical example, before Occupy occurred, I was, a couple years before, I was a sophomore or a junior or senior or something in high school, and I tried to start up a communist club, and I got laughed out of the halls of my school, where no teacher would even come close to being the academic advisor of our group.
Huh.
And it wasn't, we didn't have a full, it was sort of in a joking way trying to start that up, because we kind of knew that it wouldn't get off the ground.
Uh-huh.
But I would say I was definitely interested in talking to people about, different economic systems, but it was a joke. There was no credence granted to it whatsoever at the time.
Yeah.
And so, that this goes to show you it's an anecdotal, little tidbit there, but I failed.
I was looking ahead and actually just glanced on the next page, and he actually mentions Occupy Wall Street, so we'll get there.
Oh, okay, got it.
All right, Go ahead. I'll read, I guess, maybe one more page or page and a half. Okay, so during the post-war period, critics of capitalism were marginalized. Laws were passed that linked such criticism to disloyalty. Colleges and universities discriminated against such critics. Politicians competed in their adulations of capitalism and condemnations of all alternatives. Culture wars yielded purges of journalists, filmmakers, playwrights, and others suspected of sympathies with those who criticized capitalism as a system. The post-1940s history of the U.S. labor union movement shows the stark social consequences of punishing critics of capitalism. First, the state apparatus pressed successfully for the systematic rooting out of those union leaders and activists who dared to include criticism of capitalism in their work. They were excoriated for advocating subversive and ideological politics rather than doing their proper jobs of serving their members. Yet, as most unions fell into line, they also declined in part because of repeated attacks on unions as special interests serving only their members at the expense of the broader social good. And so, I assume you're pretty familiar with the history that he's kind of painting in broad strokes there. So, it's...
Somewhat, not too much, actually.
I'm actually trying to work on a paper with a friend of mine who does film studies, and we're focusing on some of the films that, in various ways, defied the anti-communist fervor of the 50s and the Hollywood blacklist era, where you had actors and actresses who were blacklisted from Hollywood because of supposed communist sympathies. And also you had the HUAC meetings, the House Un-American Activities Committee meetings that, you know, put people up on trial, interrogated them for allegedly having, again, communist sympathies or being communists. And then when he mentions the labor union movement, I think there's several things, but one of the most prominent examples there would be the way the CIO, they had a strong communist contingent, which actually did a lot of important organizing, I would say in the 30s, or dating back anyway. And that communist contingent, which again was like the most militant and active and usually the most responsive to people on the ground and not at all interested in whatever Moscow was trying to do, they were purged from the CIO.
Oh, wow. I did not know that.
Okay, so do you want to pick up on this next page? I have a new page at the start, so I don't know if you can tell. Okay.
I do as well. Okay, so I want to just make sure this is the right page, so let me know if I'm off. Criticism of particular capitalist enterprises or their particular practices did sometimes surface over the last half-century. It was possible to target capitalist enterprises' monopolistic activities, racial and gender discrimination, and environmental degradations, even their corruption of political institutions. However, critics learned to focus only on specific misbehaviors, not on the economic system that induced, rewarded, and reproduced them. Many oppositional movements foundered or collapsed because they excluded those who dared. Is that foundered?
Yeah.
It's supposed to be floundered. Okay. Many oppositional movements foundered or collapsed because they excluded those who dared venture some criticism of capitalism as a system. By contrast, in 2011, the Occupy Wall Street movement broke with the traditional taboo, clearly affirming the legitimacy of criticizing capitalism itself. Like any social system before we continue really quick.
Yeah.
And I hope he doesn't go over it and just answer it, but
yeah.
I'm trying to think of, the images of Occupy are coming to my mind, and I'm trying to remember if people in general were explicitly railing against capitalism itself and actually using the term, as opposed to just generally using terms like inequality, 99%, rich versus poor,
right,
social classes, and things like this, as opposed to actually hearing people saying capitalism needs a redo, or capitalism needs to be questioned, or we are down with capitalism, or something like that. Do you remember if that was explicitly mentioned, or you heard that, or you saw signs, or whatever it might be?
And I don't know if I told you this, but I had a friend who wrote a book about the Occupy movement. He was involved, pretty heavily involved with what they were doing in St. Louis. And so he wrote a little bit from personal experience there. I had attended some general assemblies, or a general assembly in Chicago, and also there was a small Occupy, because remember, they'd spread across the country, and there was a small Occupy encampment in Carbondale. And so I didn't get too hands-on, unfortunately, because I was in the middle of a PhD program and coursework. Although I thought about dropping it at the time. I was like, I really wanted to go to Zuccotti. That was it really sparked the radical imagination. And so, to answer your question, I would say that... I would say there were... it was a mix. There were a lot of folks, the folks who first organized the occupation in Zuccotti Park, they were social anarchists, right? And so they were inherently anti-capitalist. As were, I would say, many of the militant folks, probably those who helped get the occupations off the ground in various places. And I think that was the case in Chicago for sure. But one of the reasons that Occupy was so successful was because it was able to attract folks who weren't just anti-capitalist, but were fed up with Wall Street greed and the way the system was going. And so I think you're right to note that it wasn't all around an anti-capitalist movement, but it certainly had strong anti-capitalist elements in it, would be my take.
Oh, absolutely. No, and my take as well, but I mean, I would go further and say that it was like, I believe almost all of the complaints that were being made can kind of be rooted in the symptoms of capitalism.
Oh, sure. Yeah, that's a good point.
Brought on because of them.
And
whether explicitly mentioned on signs or not.
Yeah. And then in addition to that, the practice of, prefigurative politics and the direct democracy of the assemblies and all the rest of that, I would say that too reflects, an anti-capitalist vision that was put into practice on a small scale too, and that I guess is worth noting.
Yeah. All right, continuing. Like any social system long exempted from criticism and debate, the capitalist system deteriorated behind its protective wall of celebration. Big business subordinated smaller capitalists when it did not overtake them. Laws protecting labor and labor unions were weakened, repealed, or simply not enforced. Freedom came to be redefined as first and foremost the freedom of businesses to decide what, where, and how to produce without interference from other parts of society. The results of so long-lasting a bar on serious criticism and debate of the capitalist system are many and sobering. They include the return to levels of inequality of wealth and income typical a century ago, consequent inequality in the distribution of political power and access to culture, atrophy of government-provided social services and supports, and multidimensional ecological crises. In light of these developments, two central objectives of this book are to show how the severe crisis since 2007 is partly another result of capitalism, and to help reopen the space for criticism of capitalism as a key step toward bringing about fundamental social change. The capitalist economic system persists so long as labor contracts between capitalists and both productive and unproductive laborers provide acceptable quantities of surpluses to capitalists and employment and incomes to workers. Developments within the capitalist economic system and or in its social and natural environment can disrupt, suddenly or gradually, the reproduction of the system. Then unemployed workers, unutilized means of production, and the resulting loss of output can coexist, often for years, in a stunning reproach to capitalism's pretensions to efficiency, equity, and progress. Such disruptions are viewed by the masses of people in capitalist economies as, quote, hard times, to be prepared for and endured. Capitalism's defenders fear disruptions as threats to the system. Capitalism's enemies treat them as opportunities for organizing people, especially workers, to change or supersede the system. No wonder, then, that capitalism has evolved mechanisms to avoid, evade, and respond to such disruptions. Among these mechanisms have been government interventions that mix rescuing capitalists by direct subsidies, direct investments, loans, loan guarantees, below-market exchanges, and so forth, moderating mass suffering by providing state support to the unemployed and others, and passing regulations to reduce the most egregious economic practices aggravating the crises. So I have a question for you, James.
Mm-hmm.
When I read that last bit, I think of the libertarians railing against TARP and other steps taken to prop up big banks, etc. I'm wondering what kind of impact has been made on this topic that we've been discussing, capitalism and alternative economics. What impact the following has made on it? The libertarians coming out and saying, look at what has been going on, what Obama has done with TARP and the other things, and how it's kind of throwing a wrench in capitalism by having the state come in and prop up big players. How that's not capitalist, that should be taken out, says the libertarian. How dare they do that? Let them fail. That's what capitalism is all about, survival of the fittest, etc. I wonder what impact the libertarian's louder voice has made on the discussion of alternative economics. What do you think?
Well, I mean, for a while there was a significant portion of people who were interested in politics who were fed up with the system and saw the libertarian route as the only viable alternative. And I don't think I think it's a very simplistic ideology, to be quite honest, because I don't think most of them are... I don't think most of them are even serious about what it is they propose either. Or if they are serious about it, like what they're proposing could never be implemented, and if it were, it would result in the destruction of the things that they purportedly value. And so, but nevertheless, I mean, I guess I sympathize with some of their sentiments. You know, I was reading this thing, there's a recent article at HuffPost, which is about the revolution in Rojava, which is those autonomous cantons in Syria that were liberated by folks who are big fans of democratic confederalism, which was a system that was kind of partly designed, or at least expounded upon, by one of their imprisoned leaders, Abdullah Öcalan. And he got a lot of his ideas from Murray Bookchin, who was a Bronx-born, Vermont-based libertarian socialist. And, you know, one of the things that Bookchin has pointed out, or used to point out, I mean, he died in 2006, I think, but those who call themselves libertarian, they're really proprietarians. Their view of liberty is like very much private property based, and
sure.
And so anyway, like I think that's flawed, and also most of them that they do want the state, because again they want the police and the prisons to protect everything that they want privatized, and so they very much see a role for the state, and really a heavy-handed one. But I mean, I guess I do, and I think, you know, there were libertarians who were interested in Occupy too, for that matter. And I think that there are some, you know, somebody like Ralph Nader, he wrote a book about building coalitions a year or two ago, and that's one of the things that he argued, is that maybe there's room for coalition building between progressives or anti-capitalists, maybe even libertarian socialists and libertarians. Because, you know, they're both opposed to again, like, bailouts for big banks and that sort of thing, to the public subsidy of mega corporations. Yeah.
All right, so I'll continue here.
What did you have any thoughts on that though? Before you begin, before you restart, did you have any thoughts on that? I mean, you asked the question, I'm sure, for some reason.
Well, yeah, the libertarianism has always kind of confounded me, because I have some family, some cousins of mine that are libertarians, and I've gotten into tiffs with them. But this was quite many years back, and so it was pretty superficial. But libertarianism has always kind of been an interesting philosophy for me to think about, even though it's kind of easy for me to disregard, because it, like you said, it is very simplistic, and it's very I don't know. It's like you mentioned that Bookchin wrote about, that it's very much based on just the property that one has, and keeping that property, and kind of doing what one pleases, period, and that's all there is to it. A sort of
assuming you have
John Locke perversion.
Yes, yeah, assuming you have the property and wealth to do what you please. And so, yeah, there's a complete disregard for the liberty of others. That is, there's no problem with subjection of others who have to sell their labor power to somebody else, which I would say is like the most anti-individualist, anti-libertarian elements of the present system, and they don't seem to have a problem with that.
Yeah. And they do tend to favor those in power. They do tend to favor, like, individual, at least when it comes to businesses.
Yeah.
Like, they definitely set businesses on a pedestal.
And no, here's the other thing, too. Here's the other, because I was listening to, because you got me on this shtick, the Rubin Report, you know? Are you familiar?
Oh, yeah. I've watched a couple of his. Yeah, I'm familiar with him.
And, you know,
I don't agree with his direction, but...
Yeah, some of the folks that he's had on, like, I appreciated him having Laura Kipnis on. I watched when he had Peterson on. And someone, I think maybe Brett Weinstein, too.
Yeah.
But anyway, I mean, I don't know what he identifies as, but I thought I heard him say, kind of a liberal, but maybe like classical liberal, which means more or less libertarian in this context, which I would say is actually a disconnect from classical liberalism if the tenets were really respected and brought into the present context. But anyway, there's like, he had the guy, the former CEO of NPR on, who had wrote a book about breaking through the liberal bubble or something like that, because he went out and traveled across the country and talked with folks who, of course, didn't identify as as liberals as like those who worked at NPR did. And anyway, the host's comments just consistently, there is denigration of all public institutions, and you could say, well, maybe there's some justification for that, although there's plenty of denigration you could do with justification of private totalitarian oriented institutions.
Wait, you're saying Rubin himself was denigrating public institutions?
Yeah, saying like, why not just let the market do it? Like, why have government supporting? But here's the thing: is that's a very anti-democratic position. Now, they would say, well, the market is all the democracy we need, or something like that. And I would say, the democracy
exactly.
Democracy via the state is inherently flawed. I totally agree. I'm not like although I would say that some of that is worth protecting because it's a better alternative to the, again, top-down totalitarian regime that most private corporations would impose. But nevertheless, like I think that the pillars of what Wolff means by democracy, anyway, right, is like people being able to make decisions that affect their lives, right? That is not of a serious concern to libertarians, and that's indicative that their lack of respect for anything that's government, in scare quotes, run, or public for that matter, is indicative of that fact, I think.
Yeah, I agree.
So where are we?
So I guess I'll continue for a little bit here. Simultaneously, ideological rationalizations of economic crises are expressed in claims that they weed out the inefficient enterprises and thereby strengthen the economic system. Finally, there are the bold assertions by politicians that newly enacted reforms and regulations will not only extricate society from its crisis, but also prevent such crises from recurring. And that ends the first section, or is that...
That's correct.
Ends some kind of section. Now
you're right. So, do we want...
My version says 1.1.
Yeah, that's what I have too.
Okay, great. If you don't mind pausing the recording for a moment,